Hello and welcome to Cornell Keynotes. Today we have the third in our public health series and our last of 2025. My name is Sabine Jamal, and today we will be discussing cold weather emergencies, something very timely as we are seeing earlier snowstorms this year than before. Today, we're going to focus on both population and community perspectives. And joining me in the studio today is Alistair Hayden, Assistant Professor of Practice with the Department of Public and Ecosystem Health at Cornell University, and Nick Bassill, Director of the New York State Weather Risk Communication Center. As a reminder, we will be taking questions from the audience. If Please feel free to put those in the chat and we will get to them as soon as we see them. Alistair and Nick, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
So let's get started. As I mentioned in the opening, we will begin the conversation on that population level effects of weather emergencies. And Alistair, this is something you have a lot of experience of. Could you provide an overview about what we mean when we talk about cold weather emergencies?
Yeah, so emergencies are when we have events that are kind of out of our capacity, and they can escalate into disasters when they're like really, really far outside of our community's capacity to protect not just our individual selves, but our families, our neighbors, our whole communities. And so with winter emergencies and disasters, there's like a lot of different components. Every disaster is unique and has different components. But kind of the things that we're thinking about are going to be cold temperatures, which are a risk to anyone who's exposed to the temperatures, a variety of different risks tied up in that. And then precipitation can be another risk. So whether that's sleet, snow directly, freezing rain, these are things that can impact our infrastructure, make our roads unsafe to drive on, impact our power lines, our power supply, other aspects. And then another component can also be, there can be a strong wind component to some of these winter storms and events as well that provides yet another risk factor. And so this is what we're kind of keeping an eye out for with all these winter weather events to see whether they escalate into an emergency or disaster based on the severity of the impacts. And over the last, since about 2019, there's been 26 winter weather officially declared disasters across the whole United States. So it's a decent number. That's a few every year, but that is a smaller number of officially declared disasters than some of the other hazard types that we might be keeping an eye on.
And so it sounds like there are perhaps some unique elements compared to these other natural hazards you are referring to. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think for me, what makes the cold weather emergencies and disasters unique is this kind of layered compounding, all these different hazards that you're keeping an eye out for. So the cold temperature, maybe that's the first on my mind. I don't know if that's for everyone. But actually, you might be surprised to know that cold temperatures are the leading cause of weather-related death in the United States. The CDC has recorded 36,000 cold deaths over the last 2 decades, which is far higher than even extreme heat or other weather hazards, hurricanes, tornadoes. So that's a really large number. And that's just the deaths that are where a physician has logged that this death is due to the cold temperatures. There's a growing amount of research that indicates, I guess for both types of temperatures, heat and cold, physicians don't get everything. And when the temperatures get very high or very low, the death rates increase. And so it might look like a death due to cardiac arrest or something else, but the rates of cardiac arrest increase as the temperatures decrease. And actually, the most cold deaths seem to occur at kind of moderate temperatures. It's not the extreme temperatures. It's which is just, there's a lot more days with those moderate temperatures than there are the extremely cold. So the risk is only a little bit higher on moderately cold days. But there's so many of those days that when we look at the population, those are some of the events we should be most concerned about. So emergencies, though, are going to be more on the extreme ends. And that's where we're also starting to really worry about not just, core temperature, but things like frostbite on exposed skin, that kind of exposure. But then again, the other unique things are if we layer that in with that wind or that precipitation, we can lose power. And there's a lot of things that happen with that. One, it's putting us at risk in our buildings, in our homes, our workplaces, greater risk of being exposed to that cold temperatures. But also these reduced temperatures and loss of power can lead people to look for alternative heating sources. I've recently started being a volunteer firefighter, and we see an increase in carbon monoxide calls. Every year, as the temperatures decrease, we start doing training on chimney fires. People haven't cleaned their chimneys. So there's all these just compounding risk factors that come into play as in these winter weather events.
Wow, those were some really big figures you were saying, and interesting to hear that the moderate temperatures can actually, in some ways, be more dangerous. Um, Nick, so it's the same question to you about what makes cold weather events unique, but from a forecasting and communication perspective.
I think one of the interesting things about cold weather events is that it can take a much smaller amount of something to cause really big impacts. And so I'll give an example. If you were going to imagine flooding in the summertime, you're not going to get that with just a few sprinkles, right? You're going to have a big thunderstorm or some sort of tropical system making landfall or something like that, something big and noteworthy. But in the winter, if you're driving, just the tiniest dusting of snow or the barest glaze of freezing rain that causes icing on the roadways can cause a deadly accident, right? You don't necessarily need a big blizzard. And as Alistair just pointed out about sort of marginally cold temperatures causing some big impacts, that's not necessarily what you see in the summertime, right? You don't necessarily see the biggest heat problems when it's 85 degrees out. You see it when it's 95 or 100 degrees out. And so in winter, from a meteorologist perspective, which is my background, we have to communicate things at a much lower threshold when we're trying to share information with decision makers in terms of thinking about what might be affecting their population or their own decision makers. We have to share weather information at kind of what might appear on the surface to be borderline thresholds of weather events rather than really high thresholds that you might use in the summertime.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I also imagine there's the challenge of people being bombarded repeatedly with information over and over again, and it might not land the same if they're getting so much info.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And a slightly added challenge to that is if you're thinking about responses at, say a state or a large scale level, the storms that we tend to get in winter are generally larger geographically. And so we're sort of compounding those low thresholds of, just a tiny bit of snow. And they also affect, say, the entire East Coast or something like that. Whereas in the summer, a flash flood is very localized. And so it is easy, whether your information source is CNN or whether it's a government official or whether it's somewhere in the middle, to get sort of bombarded, as you said, with lots and lots of information that may be tough to parse.
Yeah. And so, Alistair, I want to pick up on something you were saying earlier and think about what systemic factors might influence vulnerability during these cold weather events.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of systemic factors. Kind of as I was saying, every event is going to have its own unique thing, but there are some overarching things that we can look at. So there's individual level risk factors, and I like to think about them in terms of your risks of being exposed to something. So people have risks about how much cold they're going to experience for how long, and those kind of risks can be related to maybe your occupation brings you into these environments for a greater period of time. Maybe the type of housing that you have or don't have access to is going to affect the temperatures that you experience, especially perhaps at night when temperatures are generally colder. And so there's kind of your exposure factors, maybe something like the quality of housing that you're in, how much insulation there is, the type of heating that you have access to, the affordability of that heating. So all those are going to impact our exposure to the cold temperatures. And then there are just some biological factors as well, that two people who experience the same temperature might have different reactions to that. And so as with many temperature things, older adults and younger children are going to be among the more vulnerable populations. And then there are some medicines and drugs that also affect our bodies to regulate our temperatures, including common things like alcohol, but as illicit drugs and some prescription drugs as well.
And I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't the incidence of MI and cardiac arrest also go up because of snow shoveling?
Oh yeah, that's a whole other one I missed. Yes, so there are many. Yeah, really, these winter events can have just so many different ways that our family and neighbors might have a really tough time, and we want to be looking out for all of these. Just one illustrative example that New York was unfortunate to experience. So the Buffalo blizzard that happened in 2022 around Christmas time was, everything I've seen described about it, once in a generation worst event. One that really got me was, I think it was the worst snowstorm not on a mountaintop in the United States. So this was just a really uncharacteristically large event, even for a location, a place that's very used to these kind of events. And the mortality events that were recorded, I think it's over 40 deaths in the county, ages ranging from 20s to 90s, folks outside who got disoriented. The visibility was so low, people didn't know where they were going anymore. Cars going off the side of the road and rescuers not being able to access them or find them. I don't think there was mortality events among rescuers that I remember, but there are stories about even some of the snowplows and first responders needing to be rescued because these equipment that are designed for this kind of weather even couldn't handle with the rate of snow and snowdrifts that were happening. But one that I hadn't seen as much in other blizzards was some people who were found deceased outside. The cause was determined that they had to go out for food because they had been stuck at home during this blizzard for so long. They'd gone through their supplies. And so there's just all these different layers of vulnerability and things that we're looking out for, especially when we get a really, really severe event.
And Nick, I believe that was in your kind of area, wasn't it? Do you have any kind of experience from that blizzard that Alistair is talking about?
I remember that extremely well. So I'm located here at University at Albany, which is directly across from our state's Emergency Operations Center at the state level. And I went over there to provide weather support during that event. And that event was over Christmas weekend. So Christmas that year was on a Sunday, and Friday was the 23rd. And Friday was sort of the last day to wrap up, or if you're going to start traveling to see families, get your last Christmas gifts, that kind of thing. And the blizzard started around 9 a.m., 8 a.m. or so that morning. So some people left right away to go do their last second errands and they got stuck. Other people stayed at home, but that wasn't necessarily a saving grace either, even if you were at home. So I learned some big lessons from that storm personally. And my lesson is kind of like this. We knew it was going to be really windy. We knew it was going to be really snowy. And we knew it was going to be really cold. but we didn't necessarily consider that it was going to be really windy and really snowy and really cold. So what I mean by that is if you had two of those three things instead of all three, um, the impacts would have been less. And so let's say it was, merely very snowy and very cold. Okay, well, you could walk to a corner store and not lose your sense of direction and get stranded outside, right? Because the wind wouldn't be blowing. If it were just windy and cold, okay, maybe the power would have gone out, and your house wouldn't have been heated, but at least then you could drive or walk somewhere where it was and you would have been safe. And so on down the line. And so my take-home message from that storm is that as a meteorologist, when we're looking at an upcoming storm, we really have to strongly consider how one weather factor relates to a different one when we are communicating about the hazards of those individual weather factors. We have to treat the storm as a sort of holistic basket of, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. weather hazards that may compound other ones. And so even though individually they may not seem that bad, if you get enough of them combined, as we saw with the Buffalo blizzard, that's what really leads to these tragic outcomes there. And that's going to be a storm that I think is going to be sort of the seminal winter storm that us here in New York think about, at least for, people like me in my lifetime.
Yes, absolutely. So something else with the Buffalo storm, and actually where we're all calling from today, is we are representing both rural and urban communities, even just in this call through the three of us. So I'll ask Alistair first, but then Nick, if you've got something to add, how might rural and urban communities experience these emergencies differently, and does that affect their preparedness strategies?
Yeah, so I like to think of these really on community specific, because there are some commonalities among rural communities that make them different than urban communities, but each one of each type is going to have its own strengths and own weaknesses for each specific type of storm. And so for me, it kind of goes back to thinking through some of the vulnerability factors that we already discussed. So thinking through, who is in my community? Are they in occupations that are going to place them outside? Do I need to be thinking about my workers? Is my community full of people who might need some assistance with heating in some way? And there's a variety of programs that can be implemented for those. And then thinking about also the age vulnerabilities and other medical vulnerabilities that my populations might have. One thing that I do think potentially might be different is I would expect in general rural residents are going to be more used to service interruptions to infrastructure, and so might have lifestyles and plans that might make them a little more used to planning ahead for the power going out, this road being impassable, at least for a little bit longer. And so there might be just some more of those preparedness built into daily life in those areas. But I don't know that I would even speak for that as a generality across all these things. And I guess one illustrative example for me in thinking about this, and sorry, I keep also talking about extreme heat, but there's a lot of similarities between extreme temperatures. But for a long time, people were really focused on, the urban heat island and the urban risks of extreme heat. And I don't think it was intentional, but that focus, due to a real thing, urban areas do tend to be a little bit hotter than the surrounding rural areas due to this urban heat island effect. But there's a lot of other types of vulnerability that many rural communities would experience, such that kind of the overall thing is we should be really focusing on both rural and urban communities for extreme heat, but maybe need to tailor our interventions a little bit differently in both places, both types of place. And I think that awareness is growing in the extreme heat world. I haven't heard quite that division in the winter weather world. But I just want to emphasize that we should be thinking about our communities as individual communities and think about what they might need to be most successful in one of these events.
Thanks, Alistair. And Nick, from your experience, are there any kind of unique elements in how either an urban or a rural population might handle these emergencies?
Yeah, so with the caveat that obviously every individual person and property and are unique. So speaking in some generality here, I think Alistair touched on this, but people who tend to live in rural areas are often a little bit more self-sufficient. They may be more likely to have a snowblower or a second car or a generator, or so insert whatever other kind of safety mechanism they have there. Than urban folks. But the caveat to that is that they, tend to be more isolated. If you're living in a series of, brownstones downtown, you can walk the 10 feet over to your neighbor's house and knock on the door and ask them if they're doing okay or if they need any help. And that may not be as feasible, obviously, in rural areas. From a response perspective, from like a city or state or county government response, the benefit about rural areas is they tend to live very close to what's called a primary or secondary road, and so those are generally plowed first, compared to, say, cities where your little kind of cul-de-sac or whatever, it might not necessarily be plowed right away. Conversely, you have farther to go to get to anywhere, right? If you're rural, you have to drive maybe 10 miles to the supermarket, or whereas in rural areas, maybe you could walk a mile to the supermarket, or I'm sorry, urban areas, you could walk to a supermarket. So I think it's highly dependent. And I might even say it's probably modulated too by the type of weather that location experiences. So for example, if you live in Buffalo, you're used to big lake effect storms in a way that you aren't used to in New York City. And so even though New York City and Buffalo, like right at their heart, are while differently sized, are both urban centers, the reaction to 1 foot of snow is going to be drastically different in an urban center like Buffalo than it is in an urban center like New York City. And so it's sort of I don't know if it's quite as simple as just rural versus urban. It's probably also sort of climatology versus a different climatology as well.
Great, thank you. So we've got some questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to ask the first one, but conversely, I might be the one best to answer it given my clinical background. But our first question is, can people get dehydrated in cold weather, and what are the clinical signs for a person that might be starting to get very unwell? Do either of you have a response for that, or would you
I,
like me to take
I,
it?
I think you should take this one if you
Yeah.
feel good about it.
Okay. Yeah, so for those in the audience who don't know this, prior to going into public health, I was an emergency medicine physician. And so to answer this one, yes, you can get dehydrated in the cold. That's usually due to not feeling thirst as much. And so that's what can lead to dehydration. In terms of what are the signs, unlike when you get hot, when your pulse starts racing and you start sweating, kind of the opposite things start to happen. So your pulse slows, your breathing rate slows. You might get some, particularly in older people, you might get some confusion that starts kind of small and then can escalate. And also notoriously, all the thermometers we have at home don't really measure our core temperature. So it's all about kind of layering and keeping warm and moving as you can, and then all the things that Alistair spoke to from his volunteer firefighting experience about making sure that we're using safe heating sources and not getting exposed to carbon monoxide in those small areas. So I hope that's answered that question. Another question we have is from Tobias, who has asked, in your experience, what planning pieces do you encourage for local public health at the outset of the cold weather season to provide more resiliency during the cold season?
I can take a quick stab at that. So as a meteorologist, one of our favorite / least favorite questions leading up to a winter is how much snow are we going to get this winter, or is it going to be a cold winter? Because those things are not necessarily super easy to predict in October or November. But with that being said, obviously making sure you have all of the essentials, whether it's cold weather, warm weather, anything in between, having something like a to-go bag, or making sure that you have if you have um, rechargeable batteries for, if that, or chargers for your phone or something like that, that don't necessarily need power. If you can get those all stocked up, that's great. If you're in a rural area that requires heating oil or something like that, definitely have that. For during or short-term notifications of winter weather, I'd recommend signing up for the 333-111 service that the state does, and that's, you basically text 333-111 with your county or area that you live in, and then you will get updated alerts about highly impactful weather coming up. And so those would be things like blizzards or winter storms, and you would get that notification ideally at least a day in advance of the event. So if you forgot to prepare, you have time to prepare for those kind of things.
Great. Yeah, and I'll add on the individual preparedness side, again, with my volunteer firefighter hat, I think some of this heating safety is one of the big things that we see. So have your carbon monoxide detector, clean any chimneys, just make sure you're safe on that aspect as well. From a more population, now like the public health hat, more population focus, there's only been some limited research on what are like actually the best interventions on a public community scale to like most protect against, give you the biggest bang for your buck in protecting your community from low temperatures. So the things on the list I'm going to give are the ones that we have checked, that some scientists have checked and said, yes, this looks effective. Things not on the list might just be because no one's checked it yet, because there's not a lot of people checking this stuff. So just want to give that caveat. But really the things that seem to be effective are improving our weather forecasts. So getting that information earlier so that we can, as a community, plan ahead and enact those plans seems to be really important. And then the other big bucket of important things seems to be getting heating for people. So whether that's programs like LIHEAP, so providing financial assistance for people to keep the heat on. Some of the weatherization programs seem to be really helpful to insulate homes so that people don't need to use the heat as much in order to keep their house at a healthy temperature. And then other things like providing healthcare seem to be really important as well.
Thanks, Alistair and Nick, and thank you, Alistair, for mentioning about improved forecasts, because that's a wonderful segue into what, Nick, you do. And I think our audience would love to hear more about what your centre does. So can you start off by giving us an overview of the State Weather Risk Communication Centre and the core mission behind it?
Yes, yeah, I can. So if I know we're kind of biased giving our conversation here, but if you in the audience think to yourself, what's a weather emergency, what's a natural disaster? You probably are thinking about things like, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Irene, the Buffalo blizzard. You're running down weather-related events. Maybe you think about COVID or an earthquake if you're from California or something like that. But weather tends to dominate those, and weather indeed impacts the state very, very, very heavily. And so the thing that was surprising to me initially to learn as a meteorologist is that in New York, and this is not unique to New York, this is true of every state, but there are very few meteorologists working in the role of meteorology, so weather, in state government. So for example, the DOT doesn't have a meteorologist on staff who's doing weather stuff, despite the fact their winter weather budget is $500 million per year in New York. And that kind of carries on for other organizations. And so there's obviously you can imagine that a real need to have additional weather support to help you understand, like, is this a storm I should plow for? or do we have to open up warming or cooling centers here, etc. So our center is a unique first in the nation type center that started our birthday, so to speak, was yesterday. We had turned 2 years old yesterday. So we are funded by the state to help specifically the state's public sector. So think state government, agencies, authorities, local government, cities, that kind of thing, with winter weather. I'm sorry, winter weather in particular, but really any kind of weather generally, and how they prepare and respond to it. So we create detailed briefings, help improve communication, and just create, we're kind of clicking in to create new products here that the state can use to better prepare for and respond to weather disaster. So I have a slide here that I think perhaps might explain, just in brief. There's no need to read everything on the slide. It's just an example. This is taken from just last week, where we had some snow squalls, and snow squalls, despite this is one of those types of events that only can produce, a 1/10 of an inch of snow, but can be extremely impactful. So an example here is a weather briefing that we shared earlier on Thursday morning there on the left. Lots of information there if you're an emergency manager in the state. But just wanted to click in on that graphic there, and then communicating kind of roadways that are most concerned and under most concern right below that. And just we then distribute that to state emergency management, and they help distribute it then even further. And so notice that graphic on the left, that gets turned into a communication by state's emergency management. So in this case, the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services. So there's a tweet or X post on the right using that same graphic and taking out some information. So ideally, we're trying to give the state the tools and the information for them to better prepare and respond to anything that is weather. And obviously winter is some of the most impactful type of weather. So that is our core function.
Wow, that sounds like a brilliant center, and happy birthday to the SWRCC.
Thank you.
So I know we've already brought up the Buffalo blizzard, but to help kind of exemplify what you do, can you speak to an event where the tools or strategies from the SWRCC proved most effective in getting timely information to communities?
Right. Yeah. And so Buffalo has had no shortage of big weather, events or pseudo disasters recently. The Buffalo blizzard was really interesting because it probably one of the reasons why it was so impactful is that it came on the heels of a different lake effect storm a month earlier that quote unquote only had snow, but it was 7 feet of snow. But so that may have kind of dulled people's reaction to it. But we've had multiple events since then of the winter variety. It seems like Thanksgiving or the week of Thanksgiving more generally has been a magnet for really significant lake effect snowstorms. And just due to the sort of nature of how our transportation works, the thruway here in New York, I-90, tends to run right directly through sort of some of the biggest lake effect snow belts, and so it gets really affected. And to add a little bit of extra spice to that, we have very big public outdoor events. So I'm thinking here something like a Buffalo Bills game out in New York, and so we've had 2 recently that were rescheduled because, not this year, thankfully, but in the recent couple of years that have been rescheduled because of anticipated weather. So I think I have a slide there, slide 2, that shows, it's the next one, Marcus. One in between. That one. There we go. Yeah, where our center, while we don't forecast for private company entities like the Buffalo Bills, because they're such a public concern, 70,000, 100,000 people going to a game and tailgating, if there's really significant travel weather, that's going to be a big problem. And so one of the things that we try to do is to help local emergency management as well as state emergency management understand the conditions both at a location, but also what will be happening to and from that location. And so an example here is just sort of like how communication works. And so we were creating for last Thanksgiving, 2024 Thanksgiving. You may recall there was a lengthy, intense lake effect snow event right before Thanksgiving that continued through the weekend. The Bills played a night game on Sunday night, and they were obviously worrying about would the snow end in time. And so it's not just about, okay, the game kicks off at 8:15, will the snow stop then? No, it's about will the snow stop beforehand, because you need to get people in to clear the roads, to shovel the stadium. Are people going to be able to be safe if they're outdoor tailgating? Can they arrive to the stadium safely if they're coming from Pittsburgh or something like that? There's a lot of different factors to think about. So this is just an example where we're doing sort of event specific forecasting and posting that online. And once that becomes online, then you don't necessarily know what's going to happen with it. So they were playing the San Francisco 49ers. And so that got picked up by SF Gate, which is a big publication out there. And then local government can share other graphics however they choose. So really, the point here is once you let go of some piece of information, you don't always necessarily know what it's going to be used for or where it's going to find itself. In this case, they were good uses, but sort of a general thing to keep note of.
Yes, absolutely. So, you've mentioned some specific events there, but you also do kind of real-time alert systems. So how do your real-time alert systems and decision support dashboards work in practice? And what makes them different to what the audience might think of as like a standard weather alert?
So there's a couple answers there. One is I haven't mentioned the National Weather Service yet, but everything we do generally kind of starts with them, right? So they're the group that issues, a blizzard warning or tornado warning, or really any kind of a weather alert that you might think of. Some of those might be the kind that go on your phone if there's a particularly, a big event causes like what we call a WIA alert. So we are really kind of standing on their shoulders and trying to take what they've produced and bring it that extra mile to decision makers. So what we're trying to do is, for any upcoming storm, explain what the current likelihood is of what the most common result of that will be, prepare any or transmit any National Weather Service warnings, watches, advisories, etc. Explain what those are talking about. But often the really biggest events are ones that are kind of frustratingly, what we might say, low probability, high impact weather events. And so if it's like a potential nor'easter on day 3, maybe we know it's possible, but we're not quite sure, is Buffalo going to get hammered, or Syracuse or Albany or New York? We know that there's potential where one place could get crushed while another doesn't. So we try to do our best to communicate what a reasonable worst case scenario would look like to those. And then separately, we can do projects with individual organizations. And so my slide 3 there, I think it is, after the Buffalo blizzard that we've talked so much about here, the county executive there, Mark Polenkars, I think it's the next one. Yeah, that one. Mark Polenkars said, I want a blizzard rating scale, just like they do for hurricanes, but for Erie County, so that our county can know how to better respond. And so they asked us if we could help with that. Luckily, the National Weather Service actually already has a tool that is sort of a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rating scale. It's just not presented in that way. It's something called the Winter Storm Severity Index. And so what that index does is it tells you for a given point what the likely severity of a winter event will be. And so what we did for them is merely take that existing scale and zoomed into Erie County, overlaid municipalities there, so each municipality could understand what their expectation was, overlaid things like snowfall forecasts, and then also kind of integrated that scale across time, so across the whole storm and across space, across the whole county, into a final rating category, so that and a emergency manager in Erie County in this case could say, oh, I see we're at a a level 3. I remember the last time we had a level 3, that was 2 weeks ago, and I had to send 8 plow trucks out and respond to 3 calls and do A, B, and C, and so they could be better prepared for what they might expect there. So we're trying to leverage the tools that are already pre-existing where we can, and just sort of amplify them in some ways and simplify them in others, and add context also where we can.
That's a really awesome graphic, and I can imagine very, very helpful to emergency managers. Um, so I know this is probably a bit of a step removed from what you do, but what challenges do you face in ensuring that that risk communication that you produce actually leads to action? And in your communications, do you address those behavioral barriers at all?
So we do on our team of 10, we do have a social scientist on our team, because we recognize that you can have the best weather forecast you could possibly imagine, but if it's communicated poorly, then it doesn't necessarily do very much good to people. So that social scientist does help us improve the language of our communication, even basic things like, if you have a rating scale, what words should you use? Do people interpret a higher level word correctly, or do they think it's actually a less bad word than a lower level word, if that makes sense? Colors are important, just basic stuff like that. But ultimately, we are not the decision makers, right? We're not the ones who are going to say, okay, open up this warming center or shut down this road. So our challenge then is to give the most information that we can that is useful to decision makers, without also giving them too much information that may be confusing. So we can try not to be pushy in terms of, hey, you should make this decision, but we can say, these are the the weather factors you might want to consider when making that decision. One of the kind of interesting things for us is that we've heard this all the time, is that you can put a weather forecast in a briefing or write it in an email or have it on a graphic, but people always want to hear you say it. They want to hear you say the words, here's what to expect tomorrow. And part of that, I think, is because they don't, they're worried they may be misinterpreting you, even though they're not, they're just literally reading what you wrote, but they're worried about that they may be interpreting it incorrectly. Maybe it makes them feel safer to hear it from a human than virtually over like an email. And I have one more graphic there, I think, the timeline. So since we can't talk to everyone all at once, we try our best to share. It's the one with just a single image, Marcus, with the bars on the top. We try to distill to the best of our ability what we can say confidently at one time, and then also let them know what we can expect. And so we create what we call timelines. So for the Thanksgiving snowfall that we had this year, a week in advance, yeah, there we go. A week in advance, we knew there was likely going to be snow, along with wind and rain, but we couldn't say exactly when. So what we try our best to do is to share information like this, where people can both see what the expectations are, but also another kind of critical question is, when will we learn the information we need to learn to make our decisions? So sometimes you can just correctly say, look, it's a week out. I think we're gonna have snow somewhere, but I honestly can't tell you when we're gonna know, or I can't tell you right now what area is gonna get hardest. And then the logical follow-up from an emergency manager would say, okay, well, when are you gonna know that? Because I wanna know as soon as you know. So if we can at least share information, both about the weather that we're expecting, but also about when are we likely to have more granular or detailed information that we can share with you, that lets them know, okay, you know what, I've done all I can for the next 2 days. I'm going to check back in when I'm 5 days out, when I'm 3 days out, etc. And I think that can help them maybe plan a little bit better and worry a little bit less.
And so you are obviously based in New York and you're working for counties around the state of New York. Is that an automatic partnership? So as soon as you hear about something, even if it's in a county you've not worked with before, you'd communicate with them, or do counties reach out to you? How does that work?
It could be either. Right now, because we're relatively new, we generally have focused more on the state level organizations, just because for one, many of them are based in Albany, and that's where we're based, and so it's a little bit easier to just invite them over to our building, or we can walk over there. Also, because of their state, they serve, the whole state, or they serve a very large geographic area of the state or population of the state. If they're, say, like a New York City based organization like the MTA or something like that. So we've generally started there, but as we've grown and our ability to interact with people has grown, and the word, so to speak, of what we do is percolated down to counties, we've steadily gotten more and more requests from counties. And so I think there's a wide variety in terms of the interest on the county's part. So for example, some counties are extremely well resourced. Westchester has an impressive emergency operations center. They have a big team there, probably have some meteorological expertise, at least somewhat on staff. While they're high profile, they might not need quite as much help as a rural county where maybe an emergency manager is also wearing the fire chief's hat and also wearing, potentially like a sheriff's badge. And I may be exaggerating there, but you understand what I mean, is that they're kind of looking for all the help that they can get. So it's kind of a hodgepodge of them reaching out to us and us kind of proactively reaching out to them.
Awesome. So to wrap up our conversation, I have a couple questions for both our panelists. Alistair, I'll start this one with you. Looking ahead, how might climate variability and climate change how might that change the frequency or severity of cold weather emergencies? And is there anything communities can be doing now to prepare?
Yeah, so as I understand it, as we move into the future, it's not just the average temperature that's going to be increasing. We're going to be experiencing increased variability in conditions, and so just because we might expect the future on average to be warmer, it doesn't mean that cold temperatures are going away. These are very much still events that we need to be planning for. We can still be getting these severe winter storms. I think so I would just encourage communities to continue planning for these events. We have been having them. They're not going to be going away. Just something we need to be still thinking about.
And Nick, same question to you.
So one of the things that we expect, obviously, with climate change is generally warmer weather, and New York is situated on at a latitude on Earth where we don't always get, it's not like we just know if we're going to get precipitation. It's definitely going to be snow or definitely going to be rain. If you're in Florida, you'd say it's always going to be rain in the winter. If you're in Canada, maybe you'd say it's basically always going to be snow in the winter. So we're right on that dividing line. And with a warming world, it seems more likely that we're going to have these kind of messy mixed precipitation events. And what I mean by that is maybe ones that start as rain and turn into snow, or start as snow and transition to a freezing rain, or start as one and go through the spectrum of other ones. And it just puts a little bit of extra stress on anyone trying to prepare for that, because if you knew that it was going to snow, you'd say, okay, great, we're going to have our plow trucks ready and we're going to salt in advance. But if it rains a quarter of an inch before it snows and washes all the salt away, you're not going to want to do that because you wasted time and energy and may have harmed the environment a little bit. So just as we have more of those, there's just a little bit of extra stress on the population. And I'll say too, we talked a lot about lake effect snow. Oftentimes, Lake Erie gets frozen or close enough to frozen by the end of the year that we don't have lake effect snow off of Lake Erie. With a warming world, that may happen less or not at all, which may mean that the lake is open for lake effect longer into the winter or even all winter than it is right now, which could produce, additional headaches.
So actually, overall, a warming climate does not necessarily mean less winter weather. It could just be
Yeah,
more confusing winter weather.
absolutely. If it goes from 20 degrees to 30 degrees, you're still below freezing, but it can keep snowing all the same.
Yeah. Lots to look forward to, I suppose. So another question to ask you both, looking forward, what innovations or improvements are you most excited about for enhancing winter emergency preparedness? Nick, I'll ask you that first.
Yeah, so I already mentioned the 333-111 tool, so that's a great one. From a meteorologist perspective, one of the things that we're sort of cautiously optimistic about is new tools such as AI or machine learning. I know that's gotten a ton of insane press about, oh, AI is going to be the next big thing, or even negative press about, not being able to interact with a real person or whatever. But from a scientific advancement perspective, meteorology is really well suited to that because we have lots of great weather observations that come in real time, high quality data that's great for AI. We can verify our forecasts pretty much instantaneously. I make a forecast for tonight, and then I know whether it was true or not tonight. So there are probably some really nice tools that are going to come down the line in the next couple of years relating to that. AIs are also very good at combining two disparate types of fields. So, for example, if you have health data and weather data, there may be new ways to understand how the weather data impacts the health data. And that could help us be better at communicating impacts.
That sounds really awesome and really exciting. So hopefully we'll be able to hear about those soon. Alistair, how about you?
Yeah, I think for me, it kind of comes back to where we started, which is this is the deadliest type of weather that we have, which I think always still surprises me. It surprises everyone because it's one that isn't new. It's been around. We have it every year. And so you'd think we would know the best ways of protecting ourselves and our communities at this point. And so I'm excited to hear that there's some new developments in weather forecasting, because again, improving those forecasts seems to be a great way to do that. I personally am excited that more and more researchers seem to be looking into this effectiveness of different methods of protecting the public, different planning strategies, other policies we can put into place to help protect ourselves and our neighbors and our communities from the cold. I think we still have a lot of work to do on this hazard in particular.
Thank you, Alistair. So that's actually all we have time for today. I'd like to thank both Nick and Alistair for joining me today. And thank you so much to everyone in the audience. We hope you have found this keynote interesting and learned something. And we look forward to our next public health keynote in the new year. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.